Hello there. I'm some guy with a shitty webcam, no editing skills, and a beard, and I'm mad at someone on the internet. So mad that I'm going to make a very long video where I nitpick their points and never give them a chance to respond. So the first video on this channel is going to be a response video to a Twitter fight that I had. So it's best possible start. It's only downhill from here.
Just gonna add mine to the top here. There we go.
So, which internet bad guy is worthy of my scorn today? Well, it's a fellow by the name of Sandre Speaks, one of the YouTubers whomst is bad. By that I mean he's yet another anti-SJW dude with a thing in the suit avatar who uses the same predictable paint-by-the-numbers approach to all political and social issues that we've seen 1,000 times before. Did he make a video getting mad at the Gillette commercial and give it the world's laziest title? You bet he did. Does he think misogyny and rape culture are overblown by the snowflakes on the left? You bet he does. The media? Bunch of fake news. Race science? Of course he... Okay, he actually debunks that pretty hard, but you know he stands all the grifters and the intellectual dark... Hold on, this isn't working for me. Okay, he does have some correct opinions mixed in with the more problematic stuff. I actually enjoyed and recommend his video on Sam Harris. You should check it out. Put a link in the description. He has a background in chemistry, and a good chunk of his content is either just straight-up chemistry videos or things related to it, like climate change. So he's a big proponent of science. But if you've been on the internet long enough to have ever heard a thing-in-a-suit avatar explain to you what they think science is, well, some of it is predictable. You see, his opinions on what constitutes science somehow manage to be both abstract and narrow. I've linked to our Twitter thread below, as sad as that sentence is, so you can make sure I'm not unfairly representing his points. Oh, hey buddy, what you doing? But at the end of our battle of the minds, I straight up ask him, what is your definition of science? And he responds with, a major thing is you need to be able to perform proper experiments. Yeah, like what? Does he know how definitions work? Like, what are the other parts? What constitutes a proper experiment? Do you have to do experiments before something is considered science? He does this a few times, just kind of alluding to things that are sometimes in science without ever giving like an overall view of what science is. And that brings us to the topic of this video. Despite never giving that definition of what science is, he's very sure about what science isn't. Do you want to guess what fields that Sandre does not consider science? I mean, it's the title of this video. I don't know why I paused for suspense. Sandre doesn't think that sociology or any social science is real science. And I don't think that it would be unfair for me to say his opinion probably extends to all of the soft sciences. You see this often on the right, who don't have the best track record of listening to any science, regardless of the field, but it sometimes also creeps over to the edgy boys on the left. This notion that science is this... Well, you know it when you see it, but it's definitely not social sciences because they're soft and use feelings and gender surveys, and real science is hard and uses just numbers and titration, and they're wrong about all of it. Sandre is wrong, and here's why. Next scene. I'm still trying to figure out lighting. Anyway, here's the dictionary definition of science. And all of the social sciences meet this definition. Fucking got him! I'll take my rational big boy card now. Unfortunately for me, just pointing out the dictionary definition and going, aha! The objective meaning of this mouth sound is contained within the sacred tome. Wouldn't fly in linguistics, one of those feely-maybe sciences, so it's definitely not good enough for us real scientists. I bring it up because the closest thing we get to a real answer from Sandre as to why isn't sociology a real science is a matter of definitions. Their studies are mere farts in the wind because they make up definitions to already established terms, and the example he uses is minority. According to the fake definition from the editors of the Encyclopedia Britannica, sociologists often use the term to refer to not just a numerically smaller group of people, but often a disenfranchised one with less societal power. For example, women might be considered a minority group even if they outnumber men, and billionaires wouldn't be considered a minority because they run everything. This apparently differs from the real definition, which you can find from the editors of Wikipedia. Huh, that's weird. I mean, if you're looking up definitions, most people would go to the dictionary. I wonder why he didn't do that. What's weird is that this recontextualization of a previously defined term is standard practice in all science. One, because usually the dictionary definition isn't going to be particular enough to apply to a specific study, and two, because the same word is going to have different meanings across different fields. Take the term fatigue, for instance. To an exercise physiologist, it might refer to the failure of the contractile elements of muscle that's reversible with rest. Whereas a physicist might think of fatigue as a material becoming irreversibly weaker due to structural damage. And then an endocrinologist would pop in and spout some bullshit about the adrenal gland and syndromes. The established definition of fatigue just means, tired? But you wouldn't tell any of these hard, throbbing scientists that their field is fake just because they have their own definition of a word. And if you don't like when a field makes up a new word to describe something, I have something to tell you about how words work. So with that spirit in mind, I'm going to give you my definition of science, and hopefully I can provide enough evidence for it that you come over to my side. And my starting point comes from the Daily Wire, of all places. This article is responding to a fairly innocuous motivational quote from Bill Nye that just goes, "Science is the belief that you can solve the problem." And author Hank Berrien just goes ballistic on him. I'm not going to link to this article because the Daily Wire is garbage, but if you're curious as to how you can get from that quote to every single right-wing talking point just spouted out rapid fire, you can Google the title for yourself and just be prepared for an experience. Anyway, toward the end of the article, after giving the real definition of science that I feel like I've seen somewhere before, I don't know, he doesn't cite it, Hank actually says something that I really like. Belief is the engine that starts the scientific process, but science is the active process by which belief is tested. I mean, that sentence is clumsy as hell because, again, Daily Wire is trash, but I really like the sentiment behind it, so much so that I'm going to steal that, and I'm also going to steal one more thing from Alex Jason of the Mythbusters. That's the writing it down quotes, and I have my definition of science. Science is the concept that we can understand the world through observation, experimentation, and collaboration. I added the collaboration bit at the end because all scientific pursuits depend on the work that came before, and I think it's important to keep that bit about belief in because otherwise you're just making up reasons to do math, and that's not good. That said, if you're on the social science ain't real science bandwagon, collaboration and purpose probably aren't where your contentions lie. No, I'd wager it has something to do with subjectivity versus objectivity, specifically in the ways you go about collecting data for your studies. Sandre said something to that effect about forms and interviews, so I figured I'd give the empirical scientific method of problem solving from my textbook, Research Methods in Physical Activity, because, hey, I'm going for my master's degree in biomechanics, might as well use it for something. They define empirical as a description of data or a study that is based on objective observations, so off to a good start, objectives right there. Then we get to their methods. You can pause the video if you need to for this next bit. Step 1, developing the problem. You need to establish what you're looking for, and you need to establish independent and dependent variables. A very simple explanation of independent and dependent variables would be, if X happens, it will result in Y, where X is the independent variable and Y is the dependent variable. So in science, you need to make it clear what thing you're looking at, as well as what effect that thing is going to have. Step 2, formulating the hypothesis. Once you have your independent and dependent variables, you should have at least some idea as to what the outcome of your study is going to be based on the previous research. If I let go of a book, it will fall to the ground. If CO2 levels rise in the atmosphere, global temperatures will increase. If my second video is about how the transgenders are ruining comic book movies, it will get more views than this one. Alternatively, it could take the form of what's called a null hypothesis, which basically just says nothing's going to happen. In statistics, that's kind of what a p-value represents. The likelihood of what happening if nothing was supposed to happen. That makes sense, right? Step 3, gathering the data. Okay, now the fun part, and the one I'm going to spend the most time defending, and that's figuring out which instruments and methods you're going to use to collect your data. You want your data to be valid, which is to say you want it to measure what you say it's measuring. You want a scale to accurately measure force, you want EMG data to accurately reflect muscle activity, and you want a survey on rape culture to give you some sort of accurate representation on a culture's view of rape. So yes, I do have to talk about subjectivity in regards to methods. I promise I'll get to that last step, analyzing and interpreting the results. Yeah, this one's in the realm of statistics, and I really don't want to get into it here beyond what I already kind of did with p-values. So all studies do it, just take my word for it. Be a buddy. Don't make me talk about it, please. So we have my definition of science, and we have the steps that I use in the scientific process. But before we check out some studies done in the social sciences to see if they hold up, let's establish one last thing from earlier. A lot of people conflate study with experiment, and while an experiment is indeed a type of study, the two are not synonymous. No, an experiment involves deliberately imposing some sort of intervention on one or more groups of people, or animals, or fields of corn, and comparing that to a control group that gets nothing and seeing if there's any significant differences between them. An example of an experiment might be a drug study, where you gave 100 participants a new super boner pill. That would be the intervention group. And you gave another group of 100 participants a sugar pill that leaves your dick alone. That'd be the control group. And then afterwards you would compare the girth and vascularity of them boners to see if you had the scientific backing to put raddest boner on the label of the bottle. The independent variable is which pill you got, and the dependent variable would be the radness of your boner. Now that's a bastardized simplification of the scientific method that you probably remember from middle school, but what you might not be as familiar with is what's called an observational study. That's when you just observe two groups and gather data on them without imposing any sort of change in condition. An example of an observational study would be if you gathered two groups of men, one with beards and one without beards, and see which group has the raddest boners. The downside of this type of study is that, let's say you unsurprisingly find out that those with luscious beards also have luscious boners. Now, since you didn't make anyone grow a beard, you can't say that growing a beard gives you a better boner, only that you found a correlation between beards and bones. If you've ever heard the phrase correlation doesn't equal causation, there's a good chance that that was referring to some type of observational study. Even if you think the link is obvious, without that intervention, you're just noticing stuff. The difference between our experiment and our observational study is that the former is trying to manipulate those boners, and the latter is just looking at them. We still have two categories of variables that we're looking at, but in observational studies, instead of independent and dependent, they're called explanatory and response variables, which actually makes more sense to me. If it sounds like I'm invalidating or discrediting observational studies, I am absolutely not. A meta-analysis, that's essentially an observational study done on other studies, from the New England Journal of Medicine showed that a well-designed observational study can be just as valid in its findings as the gold standard randomized control experiment. Fuck, I cracked on the last word! Not only that, but there are a ton of situations where, due to practical or ethical concerns, observational studies are actually preferred. Like, we've never done an experiment to prove that smoking causes lung cancer in humans, because that would kill people, but we've done a lot of observational research looking at cancer rates in populations who smoke versus populations who don't, and we found strong correlations. See the 1952 and 1959 cohort studies done by Hammond that eventually led to changes in tobacco policy. Later experiments done on animals, however you feel about that, and in vitro research where we rubbed cigarettes on cells in a petri dish until they died, I think. All that stuff helped us paint an even more complete picture. We needed both. The hard science did its job and found cancer-causing agents in the petri dish, and the half-chub science did its job and found the relevant correlations in the field. But in order to realize the actual goal of all those chemists and physicians who did that work in the lab, which was to help people and save lives, we have to study how that information gets out to the public and whether or not they change their behavior as a result of it. If we want to study the role of human behavior in things like cancer treatment, or obesity, or crime, we have to turn to the flaccid dildo of the social sciences. Let's take a look at some of their work. So, full disclosure, I just kind of picked 3 studies that were either recent or interesting to me, so I'm not making the claim that these are representative of their respective fields, if that's even possible with one study at a time. No, I'm making the claim that these are science, so here we go. Here's a study published in the Journal of Consulting and Clinical Psychology in 2019 titled Measures of Psychosocial Care Utilization in a National Sample of Cancer Patients. Step 1, let's develop the problem. Individuals with cancer have high levels of psychological distress, pretty understandably, but few are willing to seek treatment for it. The response variable, remember that's the outcome that they're looking at, is someone's likelihood of seeking mental health services. And the explanatory variables, those are the things that might explain why you got that outcome, are perceptions of psychosocial care in general and self-efficacy. Step 2 is formulating a hypothesis, and they actually have 8 hypotheses, but we can simplify it just to say that they think a trans-theoretical model can explain things. Step 3 are their methods, and they use a qualitative interview sample to formulate and distribute an online survey to cancer patients to gather data on things like self-efficacy or negative bias against psychosocial care and see why they may not be seeking that treatment. Step 4 is an analysis of their data, and they conclude that stigma surrounding mental health in general and one's own lack of belief in their ability to seek treatment for mental health services in the midst of everything else going on with a cancer patient are the major barriers to consider and overcome in the overall treatment of someone with cancer. That seems like science to me. They identified a problem, they used a shit ton of previous research to justify what they were doing, and they were very meticulous in their analysis. Now, this study has its own limitations, just like any study, and they're freely admitted by the authors. But a clinician looking for the best possible treatment for their patients, and that includes mental health, now has more science to go on. You might take issue with the qualitative nature of the methods, but the entire point of the study was to look at people's feelings. And since feelings are a part of the world, under my definition of science, that means we can take scientific steps towards understanding them, like this study did here. This next one is an experiment, something Sandre claimed you couldn't do in social sciences, so let's take a big whiff of this fart in the wind and see if it conjures up any weird sensations. You may have heard of something called belief perseverance, the notion that some people will hold on to previously held convictions even in spite of new evidence to the contrary. So it might interest you to find out that they actually have done experiments to find out whether or not that's true. One such experiment is detailed in a 1995 study titled Implicit Personality Theories and Empirical Data, Biased Assimilation, Belief Perseverance and Change, and Covariation Detection Sensitivity. Published in Social Cognition. Step 1. Problem. That thing I just mentioned. Is it a thing? Let's find out. The dependent variable, because this is an experiment, is whether or not you hold on to your previous beliefs, and the independent variable is contrary new information. Seems relevant on YouTube somehow.
Never mind, this was a mistake. Gonna take it back. Take it back now. Yep, here, take this. Take this. Take it away from me.
Step 2. Hypothesizing. A person's previous beliefs can influence judgments about new data. Step 3. Methods. First, they gave a bunch of college kids 2 traits with obvious correlation. And by sheer coincidence, it was beards and boners. Wow! You're not gonna check. Second, they let the researchers know what the data obviously said. Third, the students were given a bunch of new fake data plots on beards and bones, some of which contradicted the obvious truth, and they were asked to judge each one on its validity. Finally, after all that, they gave their personal conclusions about what they thought the true relationship between beards and boners was.
Funny the first time.
Yeah, I know. Step 4, analysis. So many numbers, and formulas, and regressions. Cherish the stats grads in your life. Anyway, results yielded strong evidence of biased assimilation in the judgments of new data. The study is actually way more nuanced. Nuanced? It's more nuanced. The study is way more complex and interesting than I probably made it seem here, so if you don't like my interpretation for some reason, I have all of my sources down below in the description. Okay, one more, this time from a journal called Personality and Individual Differences. By the way, if these journal titles are putting you off or making you suspicious, that's a good eye. That's very skeptical of you. Pay-for-play journals who are dubious in their selection process are actually a pretty big problem in the scientific community. You can check a journal's validity by searching for its impact factor, which measures the number of times selected articles from that journal are cited in other journals, and it's generally considered to be a pretty good marker of a journal's quality. It's not perfect, some journals just cover niche topics that aren't cited widely by other journals, but it's still an easy Google search away so you can do a quick fact check. This journal, Personality and Individual Differences, has an impact factor of about 2, which roughly puts it into the top third of academic journals. The study is titled Political Ideology Predicts Involvement in Crime, so a fun one to end on. Step 1. ID that problem. Criminal behavior represents one domain of conduct where political ideology may be an imperfect but important indicator. You know, we've done a few of these now, so let's see if you can identify the explanatory and response variables. Good job! Step 2. What you think? Previous research has been conflicting where it exists at all, but the literature does seem to suggest that conservatives tend to report higher levels of self-control and obedience, whereas liberals tend to report higher on things like openness and disinhibition. And since self-control has been shown to be negatively associated with crime, it means someone who self-reports as a liberal might be more likely to commit crime. Step 3, say it with me this time, methods. Data for this study came from a huge longitudinal survey that followed people from adolescence to adulthood done by someone else. This is actually kind of common in research because oftentimes data collected for one study can be used in another, and also, and I can confirm this, researchers can be very lazy. The respondents were asked to rate their own political ideology on a scale from very conservative to very liberal, as well as how often they have committed a non-violent crime like selling drugs or petty theft. I will note here that only non-violent crime was analyzed, because when they did further analyses on the data, it showed that there was no link between political ideology and violence. Hang on, that means they did do analysis. Step 4, analysis that they did do. They found significant differences in self-reported criminal activity across the political spectrum, and liberals reported committing the most crime. Remember the p-value from earlier? Well, here the p-value represents the chance that they got the results they did if the true difference between self-reported crime of conservatives and liberals was 0. The p-value in this study was 0.001, so there's less than a 1 in 1,000 chance that these data were just a fluke. I thought it was important to include this study and give you my best effort at telling you what it says. It might surprise you to learn that I am very much on the left. So much so that I'll take the time here to remind you that left and liberal are not the same thing. But this is still very much a study that could at some point in the future be used as evidence against me and my side. There's a perception that the social sciences are dominated by liberals and leftists, and there's definitely some truth to that, but that doesn't mean that every study that comes out of these fields has to be biased or junk. In my experience, the truth usually skews left, but not always. I can't dismiss this study just because I don't like what it says. And while I won't claim to be an expert on critiquing research methods, I will say that this study, like every study that I've presented thus far, is far more nuanced than... Okay, let's finally talk about subjectivity. Social and behavioral sciences do often use things like surveys and non-numerical interpretation in their work, and like all measurements, they should be scrutinized for validity. It is fair to say that we don't have the same means of measuring human behavior as we do things like mass and acceleration. So as much as it would make things way easier for me to chalk Sandre's and others' reservations up to some sort of anti-social justice bias, I can't in good faith make the claim that our lack of tools doesn't in some way impact the validity of social science. After all, no one has a social frustration meter, which is one of the points that mathematician Sergey Lang used to successfully campaign against political scientist Sam Huntington's induction into the National Academy of Sciences. By the way, they're both cancelled. However, I have 2 points of defense in favor of using subjective methods of measurement. If you hold the view that the inclusion of things like surveys necessarily invalidate the conclusions of a study, my first point of defense is going to be in favor of the hard sciences that use them. A lot of the research done on human participants must, due to ethical or practical concerns, rely on subjective or self-reported data. A big chunk of my research last year was on the link between posture and low back pain, and to the best of my knowledge, we still don't have any objective way of measuring human pain. Every single study that I had used questionnaires, and if you don't think that self-reporting can be objective enough to be considered science, that means we've never done scientific studies on pain. Now, if you think you can get around this and just look at physical structures because you think it's more objective, that doesn't always work. For example, another study published in the New England Journal of Medicine found that half of people walking around without pain have at least one herniated disc, so you could say that there's something compromised about their structure. But if they're walking around without pain and it's not affecting their function, can you say objectively that there's something wrong with them? I don't think you can make the argument that a patient's subjective measure of their own wellness isn't one of the most important outcomes to consider in all medical fields. So to exclude those measures from science is to ignore one of its primary purposes. My second point is that sometimes subjective methods of measurement are good at measuring what they say they do. By that I mean sometimes subjective measurements can be objectively verified. Thankfully, I don't have to stray outside of my safe space of the one field I know anything about to find a good example of this, and that would be the Rating of Perceived Exertion, or RPE scale. It's a scale either between 1 and 10 or 6 and 20, where you rate how hard you think you're working on a physical task, and it's been proven time and time again to be almost as effective at measuring workload as objective measures like heart rate or oxygen consumption. The RPE scale even has the distinct advantages of being free and non-invasive. It turns out that trying to do a physically demanding task with EMG needles shoved into your rotator cuff muscles or an oxygen tube shoved up your ass can negatively impact the task you're trying to measure in the first place. Other examples just from my field might be something like motivation, something that we can't objectively measure, but something that inarguably has a big impact on certain performances. Or it could be something like stress levels, something that we can kind of sorta objectively measure with hormone levels and things like that, but it's going to be so different from person to person that maybe a subjective measure of someone's stress, how stressed you think you are, is going to be more useful in determining its impact on performance. My point is that at least sometimes subjective measurements can be more practical and even more useful than objective measurements. To be clear, I am not saying that precise and verifiable measurements aren't crucial to science. They definitely are. I'm just saying that unless you have limitless time, money, technology, and a rapture-esque approach to ethics and research, you might not always be able to choose the most objective tool for the job. It's okay to have limitations in your research, because the goal of any one study is not to provide a concrete answer that lasts forever. I don't think a good scientist will tell you that they have the objective answers to anything. And instead, I think they'll say that even the most fundamental and widely accepted laws that we have are still just the best answers that we have right now. And that's assuming that it's even possible to determine what counts as objective in the first place. After all, how do you know that the standards for objectivity are themselves objective? You're goddamn right I'm going to talk about epistemology a half hour into my video. Okay, I don't know if I have enough to go all the way down the rabbit hole of how do you know what you know. So instead, I'll just give you a hilariously and ironically reductive rundown of the work of some of the most powerful challengers to the idea of objective knowledge, Thomas Kuhn and Michael Polanyi. In his 1970 book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, American physicist Thomas Kuhn discussed what he called the paradigm crisis phenomenon, in which researchers following a particular paradigm will start poking holes in it until they can find a better one. This is, in my opinion, the way scientific progress happens. We don't just accept that the answer we have right now is the ultimate objective truth, otherwise we wouldn't be looking for something more. These paradigms exist because the nature of science is collaborative. Knowledge just doesn't advance linearly as sets of objective criteria are met, but rather when a certain paradigm achieves consensus within the scientific community. If you've ever argued for the existence of climate change, you've probably used the fact that the overwhelming majority of climate scientists agree that it is happening and it is at least in part our fault. And you'd be right to do so because there is no omnipotent objective standard that can supersede scientific consensus. Because that is how we define scientific truth. Consensus. When enough scientists feel like that is the truth. This goes beyond just finding a final true answer to a question. Kuhn and Polanyi both argued in suspiciously similar ways that since every step of the research process, from the identification of the problem to the data analysis, is performed via the will of the researcher, objectivity itself is a myth. In his book Personal Knowledge, British-Hungarian polymath Michael Polanyi argues that all knowledge, even what we consider to be the most fundamental truths, ultimately come down to one's own personal judgment. And no, I won't look up what polymath means. I assume it's a sex thing. Why did you pick a chi-square test to analyze your data? You, or someone you trust understands statistics, judged that to be the best method. Why did you pick the methods you did? Well, because you judged them to be the most appropriate for the task based on studies that you judged to be valid in their own methods. Why did you pick the variables and hypotheses that you did? Why did you want to do the study in the first place? If they ever let me back in the liquor barn, I could go all day. Why do you think that research is important in the first place? What makes you think that our scientific method is even capable of telling us anything about the world for sure? Why haven't you succumbed to the existential dread of realizing the futility of your own pursuit of meaning? Kitties. And they're not the only ones who reject the notion of objectivity. Engineer-turned-linguist Benjamin Whorf advocated for the idea of language relativity, named after Einstein's theory, which is the concept that language acts as a frame of reference by which we organize our observations about the world. It works in two directions. As a speaker, your thoughts are limited by what you can convey with words, and as a listener, your understanding is limited by your own linguistic filter. Sandre had a point earlier. Science does depend on language. He just didn't go far enough. Because if language is subjective, and it is, and if science as a conceptual system depends on language, and it does, that means our most fundamental method in science, writing it down, compromises objectivity from the start. But maybe you think all those guys are full of it, and you wouldn't be in bad company. Karl Kordig wrote for the Philosophy of Science Association that any statement that claims objectivity doesn't exist is fundamentally untenable, since it's disproven when referenced against itself. You can't objectively claim that objectivity doesn't exist. That's like dividing by zero. Then again, how do you know you can't? Can you really be sure that you even possess the mental and linguistic capacity to ever grasp the metaphysical truth of... Okay, this. If you go deep enough into your reasoning process, eventually you'll get to the point where what you think becomes unjustified. Hell, some people think that Descartes' first principle, that you can be sure you exist because you are currently thinking, is unjustified because it presupposes a you is doing the thinking. Well, you know what? Those people are objectively the worst. Maybe that sort of extreme skepticism is useful when you want to clear out a party, but unless you want to exist as a catatonic blob in a very empty room, at some point you just have to go, screw it, that's good enough. And now that we have that foothold, we can use it to start climbing out of the abyss and work backwards to whatever the hell I was originally talking about. Let's accept that you don't need to know for sure to know at all, because from there we can establish that you can know things. This is a great foundation to start with because, in fact, the origin of the word science comes from the Latin word for know. And we know what know means and how it became science because we can know language. Since we can know language, that makes the study of language, linguistics, a science. When linguistics is a science, we can now build a system from language that is based on science. And any system we build together will be the result of a shared sense of reason, a common understanding that when you convey your thoughts to me with your words, I can know what you mean, and thus I can know more about you and how you think. I might never know everything about how you think, but I don't need to know everything to know more. And since we can know more about what and how other people think, that makes the study of what and how other people think, psychology, a science. Then we might start thinking about how we can use this knowledge to improve the world around us. Maybe we want to know more about what thought patterns might lead someone to commit a crime. And since we can, and that part of that understanding is going to come from knowing more about how society functions, that makes the study of society, sociology, a science, as is the study of crime, criminology. As we keep collaborating in our pursuit of knowledge, we discover ways to make our system more robust by sharing methods that have consistently worked for us. We develop a scientific method of experimentation that can be used with varying degrees of modification to learn more about anything it's possible for us to know. And as more researchers across more fields adopt these methods and add in their own, it creates a positive feedback loop where discovery in one area of science accelerates progress in another. Because science is an umbrella of knowledge, and everything underneath it is interconnected. Any scientist who rejects a field of study does so by denying that anything can be truly known about that field. They're not always wrong, but there is always the risk that they're starving themselves of information, and science is the pursuit of knowledge. And whether it's biomechanics, or chemistry, or human behavior, I think that with the right observations, experiments, and collaborations, we can know more about the world's most pressing questions. Maybe even the most important question of all. Why haven't I shaved this stupid beard?